Asexual reproduction. This lesson will be focusing on plants and bacteria. The following one will be looking at yeasts and fungus, where we're looking at budding and sporulation, and also looking at protists, where it is by budding and binary fission. This is just a quick look at the outcomes covered in this video and the next one. You can pause that to tick them off. Okay, so what is asexual reproduction? Well, firstly, looking at the word asexual, usually when you put an A in front of something, it means that the word then takes on the opposite meaning. An example of that would be typical. You might talk about a typical thing, but if something is atypical, then that means it's not typical. So asexual means it's not sexual reproduction. There is only one parent needed. And because there's only one parent, the offspring is identical to that parent. And importantly, it is identical to each other. So all the genetic material comes from one parent. The offspring is basically a clone of that parent. Now, that is different, obviously, to sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, the offspring is not only different to the parents because they're a mix of the parents, but the offspring are also different to each other as well. And that comes through meiosis, which we will learn about later. But the process of asexual reproduction is mitosis. Mitosis is simply a fancy way of just saying you just have one cell that just divides into two. So looking at the differences between sexual and asexual reproduction, so we can highlight them. So the number of parents, obviously with sexual reproduction, that's two parents. Asexual reproduction, one. The processes involved, meiosis and fertilization is involved in sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, you just simply mitosis, which is like normal cell division that all cells in our body undergo except for formation of the gametes. When we talk about gametes in sexual reproduction, then yes, they are involved. In asexual reproduction, the gametes are not involved. It's just simply, splitting any cell into two. When we talk about offspring for sexual reproduction, they are different to the parent and each other. Different to the parent again because they're a mix of the two parents, different to each other because of meiosis, which you'll learn later. And with asexual reproduction, then the offspring, they're identical to the parents and each other because everyone is just a clone of the parents in that case. When we look at variation, sexual reproduction does create a lot of variation, which again we'll go into with meiosis, and just because it's a different mix of the two parents. With asexual reproduction, there is no variation. Well, it says no variation here. We'll say there's a lot less variation. We could talk a little bit about there being a little bit of variation with asexual reproduction because every time there is cell division, you have to make a complete copy of all of the DNA. In making that copy, there is always a chance that some small errors will be introduced. So if we're talking about a population of bacteria where it could grow up to be billions and billions, they're not all going to be exactly identical to each other because of just random errors in DNA replication that's involved during cell division. There's going to be some variation, but it's going to be a lot less than you would find with sexual reproduction, and also that variation is not really deliberate. It may be selected for a little bit if it does provide an advantage, but there is no specific mechanism that's trying to create variation when we're talking about asexual reproduction, whereas there is with sexual reproduction. Okay, so the advantages of asexual reproduction. So it enables organisms to reproduce very quickly without having to find a mate. So being able to reproduce quickly means that they're able to take advantage of favorable environmental conditions to ensure continuity of the species. So reproduction can occur even without a mate, which allows the continuity of the species. So they don't have to expend energy or time or effort or risk predation, risk negative consequences by having to find a mate. They can just kind of get on with it. And if conditions are favorable, if there's no selection pressure, which there isn't always, species can go through long periods of time where there's no selection pressure, then this can work very well for them. And if especially the second point, if an organism is particularly well adapted to its environment and the environment is stable, then it can just kind of keep replicating and it can go for gold and do very well. So this advantage will allow for continuity of the species. So the disadvantage of sexual reproduction is just very simple. That is, there is no variation. Well, let's think about that as there is very little variation or less variation than with sexual reproduction. So because all offspring are basically identical to the parent, they're all the same, there is much less chance that if there is some negative change in the environment and some kind of selection pressure, then there's a very small chance that there's going to be some kind of variant that might have a trait or phenotype that will allow it to survive the selection pressure. So that would put the whole population at risk, meaning there would be no continuity of the species. So which organisms use sexual reproduction? So plants do. So with vegetative propagation, bulbs and runners, which we'll be looking at in this video. Fungi through budding and spores, we'll be looking at in the next video. Bacteria through binary fission, we'll be looking at in this video. And lastly, protists through binary fission and budding. Now, it's a small point at the bottom. Occasionally, and it's very, very rare, some vertebrates do actually reproduce through binary fission, and some of the animals that can happen in is things like sharks, stingrays, lizards. There's different mechanisms. It's all very complicated, and I'll just highlight again, it's very, very rare, but it does happen. I mean, some of the instances they've been able to kind of know that and prove that is that animals that are in captivity, where, for example, you'll have a female stingray in a tank that's been there for years and years and years, and there's never been a male, and it suddenly becomes pregnant. And then they actually can genetically test that the offspring and see that it is identical to the mother. So in those cases, it's usually where an egg is, an egg develops into a zygote and a new organism without actually being fertilized by a sperm. So look, it does exist, but it's very, very rare. We're not really going to look into that, but just to be aware of it. It wouldn't be something you would be examined on, I would imagine. So asexual reproduction in plants. So asexual reproduction, it's called vegetative propagation. It involves a new individual arising from portions of the root or the stem, leaves, or buds of adult individuals. I'm not sure how much gardening you have done, but it's the type of thing where you may have heard of a plant cutting, the idea that you can cut a little bit off a plant, put it in a new pot or soil, and then a whole new plant can grow. So the new plants are genetically identical to the parent plant because there is just one parent. It is just dividing through mitosis. It is asexual reproduction. So the feature of that is genetically identical. There are many types of vegetative propagation. We'll look at those in a bit more detail. So looking at vegetative organs. So some adult plants produce vegetative organs such as bulbs. So bulbs are an underground organ, such as roots or stem, and they contain enough stored food to sustain the plant in a dormant state from one season to the next. So usually that means during wintertime when there's no favorable growing conditions, the top part of the plant will disappear. The bulb just lays dormant in the soil. We'll go through winter, and once the weather warms up again in springtime, then there is enough energy in the bulb to then kind of grow the new plant again. But I guess importantly, in terms of asexual reproduction, if the bulbs are separated, then each separated bulb will give rise to a whole new plant. So examples of plants with bulbs, one of the classic one is daffodils. Other plants with bulbs will be things that that you would use in your cooking. So like garlic, onion, green onions, leek, so all bulbs. And again, just the idea is if we kind of separate them out, then a whole new plant would grow from it. Like a second main type of vegetative propagation is through runners. So runners are modified stems that grow horizontally across the surface of the soil. And as you go along that horizontal stem, there are little sections called nodes. And so at the node, there can be new roots and leaves that grow that can then form a whole new plant. And again, let's see the features of that new plant. It would be genetically identical. There's only one parent. So examples of plants with runners is strawberries. And again, just showing a couple of pictures there where we start off with one plant, we get the horizontal kind of runner moving across, and from a node, a whole new plant grows. Spinifex grass, which is the type of grass you usually find in beaches, sandy areas, deserts. If you've ever kind of seen it and tried to rip it up, and you might find this big long runner that's kind of like you're pulling up on the ground. It's often common in a lot of grasses. So now asexual reproduction in bacteria. So we know bacteria, they're unicellular, they're prokaryotes. They have no membrane-bound organelles. There's a tiny bit of organization in them. It's not just a random mess inside, but they are not organized to the extent of eukaryotes. So they reproduce using binary fission, and binary fission is simply splitting into two. So the stages involved in that are just simply they need to make a copy of the DNA first. Once they've got two copies of the DNA, then the cell kind of splits into right down the middle. The two bits of DNA go into each cell. We now have two cells. That process of the cell splitting in two is called cytokinesis. And to be learning furthermore on that, would refer to that worksheet that you have done. And that concludes this video.